Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Dalgarno Institute. My name's Shane Varco, and I'm going to be sharing with you on a topic tonight that's dear to our heart and something we've been working on for quite some time. We've had approximately 30 years of a harm minimisation framework, which importantly includes demand reduction and prevention as some of its key aspects, but they've actually been lost on the way. And we believe it's time that prevention was back on the table, aggressively and fully fledged. So tonight's going to be a little bit about that. To start with, ladies and gentlemen, context is everything. Sure, what you do is important, where you do it, who you do it with, how, all important things, absolutely no argument. But the key thing, the most important thing in all of this is why we do what we do. Context is everything. If you've got no sustainable why, you are fodder for the system. You're one of the most easy persons to manipulate, to take advantage of. If we don't deal with the why, if we don't go to some of the key issues, the foundational issues of this, all we're going to continue to do is work with the symptoms of alcohol and other drug use and abuse, rather than dealing with the origins, the causes, and the recovery processes needed to get people away from that.
When I was about 12, I started smoking marijuana. By the time I was like 14, 15, I was using amphetamines and ice and ecstasy. And 17, 18, I was on heroin.
The second drug I tried was heroin, and I liked that straight away.
I learned from a young age to not speak out hurt and just bottle it in.
I got involved with prostitution to afford my habit.
My life revolved around drugs. I wouldn't go to school unless I could get drugs. I wouldn't go see my family unless I could get drugs. That's all my life entailed. Getting high.
To be quite honest, it did take away the hurt, but it didn't take away the problems.
It was controlling me.
It had control of me.
You know, at 18, they were getting on with their lives, going to university, working full time, and I was drinking daily and smoking dope and hating myself.
I'm telling myself that it won't go on forever.
Mum, can you babysit for an hour? I promise I'm only going to be an hour. 2-3 weeks later, I'd come back. I missed my son's first day of school. It was my mum and my sister. You know, that's a pretty big thing.
You know, I tried it with this girlfriend of mine, and she smoked dope regularly. I was really sick, and I was actually really frightened. I said I felt like I was going to have a heart attack, and I really felt like I was dying.
You're self-medicating for whatever reason.
Pain, hurt, was all just pushed so deep, I just didn't have to feel. I was like a zombie, an emotional zombie, that's what I was.
I started getting paranoid, just of what people were thinking about me.
You look disgusting. You don't care about yourself. You don't care about the way you look. You don't care about whom you hurt.
It didn't just affect me. I said I have 2 beautiful children, and they have been deeply and forever affected because of my drinking and drug taking.
I've had 4 miscarriages, all due to drugs.
The emotional problems, they stay there and they fester. It's like sweeping dirt under a mat.
Yeah, just want a normal life.
What turned my life around really was the realisation that I couldn't live like that anymore. I just thought I'll do anything to get my life in order.
Yeah, I am in a new space right now, and I'm learning their truth about myself and who I am.
And self-worth through my faith, and just a different bunch of people around me has just changed my outlook. So there's something bigger, stronger, clearer and true. Something, that I hold on to now.
If I had my life over again, I absolutely would not touch anything at all. Any drug, alcohol, no way.
Who here believes that their children or grandchildren will be better off on drugs? No hands? Nobody's got a hand up? Surprising. Okay, next question. Who here believes that their children or grandchildren will be better off with easier access to drugs? Again, no one. Surprisingly, I've done this, as I said, with scores and scores of audiences, and I've never had a single hand go up yet. Because it just doesn't make sense. Look, intuitively, we all know substance use is dangerous. I mean, no one's going, hey, this is a good thing for us. Not only for the individual, but for those around them. So that alone should be enough for a key driver to understand what we need to do to make changes in our culture. What would it take to have your community free of illicit drugs? And if you're thinking about that and you're looking at some of the process and you're starting to investigate it in your world, then you become part of the solution. The answer is simple, but it's not easy. Social and familial and political will to do what needs to be done. In essence, from our perspective here at Dalgarno, we need to restore the diminishing cultural resilience. The framework to make good, ethical, moral, others-focused choices to resist peer pressure. All these kind of things are vanishing in young people. But more importantly, our capacity as a culture to be resilient to the diseases of dysfunction is diminishing, and that needs to be restored. Young people have a right to grow up in a society where they are protected from the pressures to drink and from the harm done by alcohol or any other drug. And our culture, our society should be lauding that, promoting that right. But that's not what seems to be happening. We become adults, and all of a sudden as adults, we no longer feel like in some of our first world ideologies that we are no longer responsible for our neighbour. We no longer have to care about the well-being of others. I get to do what I want, and we took the term human right in front of any statement I make, and away I go. But we've got clear statements here from health organisations and United Nations as well that talk about the rights of children and the right for them to be safe and protected and nurtured and be given the resiliency capacity to be able to make smart choices. But if you diminish the resiliency capacity of young, of course the resiliency capacity of the old and of the broader community also diminishes as well. Keep that in mind as we move forward. Now, there's some demand drivers in our culture. And these are the ones that we've identified in looking at the evidence, looking at the outcomes, as well as the shift, the anthropological shift over time and some of the things that have emerged in the last probably 25, 30 years, particularly under harm minimisation frameworks. The first category is psychosocial issues. The way I think, the way I interact with the society, the way society interacts with me, issues around mental health, how I see myself, the idea of esteem, where that comes from, and the social expectations. The second driver is paradigm issues, worldview issues, how I see or place myself in the world. And of course, permission issues. This is one of the emerging biggest driver, I think, we're discovering. More and more permission messages coming through. So these are the three big demand drivers we believe need to be addressed. If we're going to reduce demand for substance use and misuse, we're going to have to hit these categories. To shift culture, we need to address these, and the following three arenas are important to this end. These three key arenas are the cognitive domain, the affective domain, and the judicial domain. Now, the cognitive domain, I'd like to start with cogent cognition. Intuitively, everyone knows taking an illicit substance, a psychotropic toxin into one's body, the ramifications of these substances are quite disturbing. And we see the outcomes of this all the time, behaviourally, relationship breakdown, familial dysfunction, productivity issues, crime, it just goes on and on and on. So why isn't there this cogency when it comes to the cognitive domain? I mean, the evidence is there. Sure, there's fluffy bits of evidence around, but it's, it makes you fun and it could have some beneficial side effects. So it creates this sense of, I'm not sure. So it needs to be clear, logical and consistent. And we believe the evidence is clear, logical and consistent, that drug use is something that needs to be prevented, at the very least prevented. In doing that is we need to arrest and reverse the cognitive dissonance in the message and the communication. Now, when it comes to tobacco in Australia, arguably the lowest smoking rates per capita in the world. We've got this remarkable success rate around tobacco. And the campaign for tobacco in this country, the campaign is one word, and the word is quit. The ultimate goal is cessation. There's no argument there. There's no equivocation on that. We want you to stop smoking forever. We know there's a journey to that end. We know it can be difficult. There can be a stop and start, and that's all in the messaging. So we've taken a socially acceptable legal drug, put in place demand reduction drivers, set up a campaign called Quit, and it's worked. We've seen incredible reduction.
Every cigarette is doing you damage.
With alcohol, the policy mantra is moderate, moderate, moderate. Two socially acceptable drugs, tobacco and alcohol. Alcohol is now arguably doing more damage than cigarettes has ever done. But the policy is moderate. But when it comes to illegal drugs, when it comes to illicit substances like, ecstasy, cannabis, heroin, crystal meth, the policy mantra seems to be use but don't die, use but don't die. You can't help it. Use it safely, but just don't die. So hang on a minute. One is quit, stop. One is moderate, and one is keep using because you can't help it and we can't stop it. Just stay alive while you use, and we're going to help you do that. The clear projection for cessation and the drivers and the supports for cessation are almost non-existent because there's been an emerging culture that has seemingly convinced certain policymakers that this isn't a quittable offence. We can quit tobacco, but we can't quit illicit drugs. And the amount of people on tobacco were exponentially greater than the amount of people that are on illicit drugs. So the cognitive dissonance in this process is really quite disturbing. And the message is getting through that, okay, I can't possibly get off drugs. Yet we know thousands of people, organisations where full recovery, drug-free recovery is not only possible, but it's done and consistent. But that's band-aiding at the end. We want to move back into a prevention space. We've put together a snapshot, if you like, what we call the permissibility problem. Acceptability, accessibility, and availability all increase consumption. That's an underlying axiom in the culture, particularly of substance use. For example, what we call the permissibility transaction. In an attempt to either make palatable or pragmatic our choice around substance use, what we do is we move from objection and concern, which our culture had 30, 40 years ago, to tolerance. We're sort of driven into that space where you've got to be tolerant, okay, it's going to happen and it's not good, but, come on, accept it. Then the subtlety shift to acceptance and then normalisation. And the normalisation process is a key to getting perception that this is part of culture now, accept it, live with it. So once something becomes normalised, it becomes an entitlement. It's my right. There it is. Put the term human right in front of this, and away you go. How can you argue with that? And then the entitlement moves into necessity. This is absolute imperative. So no longer is it entitlement, I need this. And of course that moves to cultural intractability. In other words, you can never possibly get rid of these out of our culture. You get that message in people's heads, they give up. They just go, well, we'll just have to manage it then, won't we? And then finally, remediation. Eventually it comes to the point where people go, this is, because it gets out of control, as we're seeing now. Crime's out of control. The healthcare budget's out of control. We need to change this. So we start to remediate, and the cycle goes back into a prevention phase, if you like. Underlying all this is a lack of understanding in the emerging culture. Again, that resiliency. When you're listening to propaganda, you're listening to your peers, you're listening to the socially acceptable messages, it's intractable. You can't help it. It's always going to be here. It's normal. It's your right. It's your right. Hey, my peers do it, and they're not dead. When those messages keep coming through and the young aren't being taught differently, they're just being taught, you're probably going to use drugs by a growing number of drug educators, this inevitability of drug use. You're going to use drugs, you can't help it. Just be careful when you use them and try not to die or try not to get sick or hurt someone else. Hang on a minute. So the message comes through. On top of that is this level of ignorance in young people, their inability to pick up the cues because they've not been taught to think critically. They've been taught to think based on whatever mood, urge, taste or symptom tends to drive them. Now the culture of permission to fit is the next big driver. And again, when a person is socially, emotionally and culturally lacks resilience, the factors that we need to have to make us strong and resilient, then we look outside of that to try and find ways to fit. And the cues we get from the culture, the cues we get from our peers, will be the drivers of how we need to fit. Now, what's interesting, two of the more significant drivers for use of illicit drugs in the 14 to 24 bracket or demographic, in the first world especially, are one, peer pressure, and the second one, interesting, is curiosity. Both aided and abetted by permission culture. For example, how easy any drug, legal or illegal, is to get. And of course, the other aspect is perceived risk. The more a substance is normalised, it's this sense of, okay, well, this guy or girl seems to be okay with this, so maybe it won't affect me. And I listen to the propaganda online. I have no idea what the real evidence is because I don't read scientific journals. I don't read medical journals. I just listen to the propaganda. I just listen to what my peers tell me is okay. I listen to what the advertisers tell me is okay. And it begins to influence the way I tick. Just want to shift track a little bit and look again at the next layer of permissibility, what we call the culture of self-medication. Dr. Alex Wodak, who's probably Australia's preeminent pusher for drug liberalisation in this country, was on record as saying this: for many people, life is quite stressful. A brief chemical vacation is one of the ways many people cope with the vicissitudes of life. The statement around stressfulness, the lack of resiliency in society, is making us less capable of being able to deal with stress, less capable of being able to deal with anxiety or the vicissitudes, the issues of life that create difficulties for us. And so therefore, when we have those moments, I need a break, I don't need to deal with the problem, I just need to take a chemical time out. This all buys into the lack of resiliency in the culture, the capacity to do this, but adds another level of permissibility. You need to manage this, so therefore it's your right to do it however you choose. I want you to look at what that permission can do to waste a life.
Shut up! Stop looking at me! This wasn't supposed to be your life!
I'm gonna try meth just once. I'm gonna smoke this just once. I'm gonna steal just once. I'm going to sleep with him for meth just once.
I'm going to try meth just once.
You sure? Yeah, just go. Okay, now, blow it out. Blow.
You did it, kid.
You're in.
You're one of us now.
You did it.
All this is yours.
We're gonna be shooting up together.
We're gonna steal together.
Sleeping together,
We're gonna
too.
sleep together. You are gonna love every single minute.
No! I'm trying it just this once.
To fix this, we need to address culture. For example, pop-driven and viral mode, which is absolutely prolific now. That's the one where the most propaganda is driven, as I said before. But what we argue is that media, government, education, vehicles, for example, like schools, all need to be on the same song sheet regarding the prevention message. So we can't have, the government policy saying A, B and C, but media saying, well, who cares about what the government policy is, do whatever you want, we're going to write an article about the benefits of smoking cannabis to relax. And so those things really need to be changed. And that's a tough one, but that needs to be done. Secondly, we need to look at cultural abuse. Now, Professor Michael Resnick, this is a term that he particularly coined. What we've done is we've taken what used to be a cultural responsibility to give young people a framework to work in, what is fair and right and good, what morality might look like, giving them that framework and helping them develop and grow in it. And we've said, no, all that's gone. The responsibility is now all on you to create that. You need to create your own paradigm, your own value systems, your own purpose, your own meaning, your own direction. You need to do that. And we've landed it on the teenager, the adolescent, who's now more, arguably because of the way adolescence has now emerged in the 20th century, with less rites of passage, with less understanding of what their cultural expectations are, of less ability to actually frame and think clearly about issues. What we've got now is a young person who's just overwhelmed and they're just taking bits and pieces of what they think's okay and operate on feelings which are also being influenced by other factors, including media and peer pressure and propaganda, you can see what's happening, folks. You can see where the young person is going, I can't do this. And that's what Resnick referred to in his general thesis as cultural abuse. We need to change that. We need to actively work against this permission model. Look, it's your right, it's okay, it's normal. We need to work against that. It's not right, it's not okay, this is not normal. Normalisation messages, control language, you control culture. This is what propaganda is all about. You can't say this about drug use. You can't say that about the drug user. So we silence our prohibition language and we increase our permission language. And kids are going, okay, well, no one's saying this is bad. Oh, you can't say it's bad because you might denigrate someone. You can't make pejorative remarks. What's a pejorative remark? Drug use is dangerous, foolish, and it's going to destroy your life. Oh, no, that's too judgmental. So we erase that from the dialogue. And of course, prefacing everything you say or want to do with the term human right makes everything okay. Anyone wants something they think that they feel they need, they just say, it's my human right too. And when it comes to drug use, this is prolific. It's my human right to do what I want. It's my human right to put into my body what I want. The question that we're not asking is, what about our right to be human? Substance-free first. One of the problems we have in our current culture around alcohol and other drug use is that we have set a priority of reallocating away from prevention, away from demand reduction. Even though it's part of the current harm minimisation framework, we've not allocated resources to that. Of course, policy permissiveness. Harm minimisation has been hijacked by harm reduction only ideologies. And such a focus has been that now the term harm reduction and harm minimisation are interchangeable. In other words, this is normal. This is what we've done. So the policy has now created a permissiveness. It's inevitable. You can't change it. And this kind of conduct continues to drive bad policy interpretation. Now, what's interesting here in all of this, Sweden as a nation has actually successfully done much of what we just talked about. They were one of the first nations to descend into drug use policy permissiveness back in the 60s and 70s, and it was a disaster. And this country has worked incredibly hard in all the arenas that I've talked about to a place where now they are one of the lowest illicit drug use rates in the entire world. One of the architects of that successful policy, he said this: to combat drug epidemics by means of individual treatment of addicts is like attacking malaria by hunting mosquitoes. It can occupy an enormous number of people, but the effect is negligible. What is required, said Niels, is drainage of the marshes. That's what we need to do. That's why we've talked about the cultural recalibration. That's why we've talked about the need to engage in developing cultural resiliency. Because unless we drain that marshes, by doing that, we're going to continue to have this ongoing problem, which will seem to be intractable because we refuse to do the simple but not easy thing. Okay, so we've talked about the first domain, the cognitive domain. But now I want to move on to the second key arena we need to engage in if we're going to shift culture away from the permissiveness of drug use towards a prevention model. And that is the affective domain. Now, this is a key domain if we're going to develop true cultural and personal resiliency in our society. Famous author Stephen Covey said this: in between stimulus and response is the greatest power you have, the power to choose. But what is influencing your choice? That's a key issue. That's the idea of propaganda, limiting information, driving the same points over, feeding it with peer solidarity and media affirmations. So the kid, the emerging adult, is developed or framed in this really narrow one-dimensional space. There's an old adage, what you're aware of, you can control, but what you're not aware of controls you. And with substance use, you see that all the time. Once those decisions are made, that usually, from that point on, the decisions are making that person. They're not making choices anymore. They'll tell you they are. Most addicts, the most dependent people and addicts do. I'm in control, I'm okay, I don't have a problem with this. And every time they step back in that same cauldron, that same crucible. The old statement, but Shane, you don't get it. Teenagers are going to rebel. You can't stop it. You just have to manage the damage. That's what we're going to do. Now understand, ladies and gentlemen, understand that adolescence is actually a 20th century construct. That didn't exist. We had children who went through rites of passage, were given responsibility, became adults. But now we've created this playing field. And of course in our first world West, with recreation, disposable income, these are drivers that also add to that space. The brain's going through its second most important stage of development and maturation. And that point of that developmental phase of the brain is absolutely imperative. And all the evidence is in, folks, all the evidence is in. There is no such thing as any safe drug use, legal or illegal drug use, for the developing brain. Every drink, every substance will do some measure of damage. Look, it may be minute, arguably. We know that from the evidence. Evidence-based best practice for the developing brain is not to use substances at all. Rebellion and reward are very, very interesting dynamics in the developing brain. Neuroscientists are now finding that reward element in the brain is really, really key. The way the brain development chemistry is engaged will determine whether the emerging adult is rebellious or not. How we've been designed is remarkable. The byplay with family, values, behaviours, structures, discipline, motivators, relationships, healthy or unhealthy, brain development together, and epigenetics work together like a recipe to develop that unique human being. Rebellion is not a foregone conclusion. If those things are done well, then the brain experiences reward. If the brain and body is engaged properly with exploration, not just experimentation, in what for functional civil societies is considered good, right and true, then the reward centre of the brain is less likely to experiment with substances. Science is making that clear. There's definitely both options on the table, but it's all about how that's engaged. Culturally, familiarly, as well as environmentally, biologically, all those things matter. Children were not meant to grow themselves up and just do whatever they want to do and emerge. That's not how it works. We know that from the evidence. One experiment that bears out this principle, a history of adolescent alcohol use alters the dopamine signalling to risk and not reward. The very important distinction there. Thus, a corruption of cost encoding suggests that adolescent alcohol use leads to long-term changes in decision making by altering the valuation of risk. So the brain is built for reward, and so it looks for good reward, satisfaction, fulfillment, meaning, direction, purpose, healthy family relationships, being loved, significance, identity. Those things are imperative for the emerging adult to experience healthily and wisely and well. But when they're not, right, and they introduce a substance during this adolescent or developmental brain phase, the encoding of the brain says, oh, this is fun, this is good, push the button, I'm liking this. The reward button gets pushed, but it's pushed in a lazy way. I don't need to work for this, I just need to do that, take that. The vicissitudes of life. Take that. Chemical timeout. Take that. I feel good. Shortcut. But what it also does is it then, with this developing brain, says, oh, there's not much risk, there's not much risk, there's not much risk, there's not much risk. The perception of risk diminishes. So taking a drug, a substance, is a good thing and it's rewarding. The risks behind it are low. That's what's going on biochemically in the brain without any other cultural cues. So you see what's happening when the cultural cues and the substance taking at that adolescent age really sets up young people to fail miserably moving forward. Alcohol now has been seen as the gateway drug for teenagers, not cannabis, but alcohol, leading to the use of tobacco, marijuana, and then other illicit drugs. So again, you can see all these factors working together, folks. And this is why we need to shift culture. This is why prevention needs to be holistic. It can't be just tell them don't do drugs. We need to, as a community, to get behind this, not just sit there and abdicate from responsibility or let people who are dangerous simply get their message out and no one else gets to have a say. Let's move into potential parent impact. Parents, you have more influence on resiliency and development and growth and prevention, that's the key word here, than you know, and more than you're led to believe, which is really sad. Positive parenting protects against the risks associated with growing up in a poor and deprived neighbourhood. So you can be in a poor neighbourhood, terrible neighbourhood, but when you've got great parents who love their kids, who are proactive with them and supportive, those kids are actually remarkably strong for the most part. They don't get involved in illicit substances or crime or vandalism. This particular study we look at here came out of the US. Parents, their views, their help have enormous impact on drug use. When parents disapprove of smoking and actively disapprove and model disapproval, look at the reduction. The number of kids, it goes from 40% down to 10%. When it comes to marijuana, when parents disapprove of marijuana use and of course don't use it themselves, the use of marijuana goes from 30% down to about 9%. When parents help with homework, if they didn't help with homework, the illicit drug use was around 20%. When parents helped with homework, it was down below 10%. And of course with smoking, same deal. When parents helped with homework, kids were far less likely to smoke cigarettes. These are just some snapshots of realities that can work. They can make a difference. So again, you have a remarkable influence, but the culture, some of the data you're getting in the public arena doesn't reaffirm this, doesn't share this. And that's what needs to be out there. If we're going to shift culture, we've got to empower families and communities, and we do that through proper education, through media, through schools, through policy that reinforces these kind of things. Now, the question I want to ask us as an audience, are you or we adding to demand or are we reducing it? There's no fence sitting with this one, guys. We're either trying to reduce demand by engaging in some of the things we've looked at this evening, or we're actually adding to it. And passivity is adding to it. So modelling is really, really important. Culture and modelling. Etymologist Richard Eckersley, brilliant academic, wrote this. He said, young people have a particular vulnerability to the failure of what modern Western culture to do well what cultures are supposed to do. And what's that? Provide webs of meaning that shape the way people see the world, locate themselves in the world, and behave in it. Now, when we abdicate from that and just land on the individualistic frameworks, we're going to increase anxiety, we're going to increase depression, we're going to increase all those things that the vicissitudes of life will add to that need a chemical timeout. So to fix this, what we need to address, again, context, paradigm, the why, how a person sees the world. We've addressed at Dalgarno, there's 4 categories that we've identified that tend to mobilise or motivate kids into substance use. So first one, relentless pain. Let me tell you a quick story about a girl that we interviewed for our I Wish I'd Never DVD series. Her name's Michelle. Relentless pain was basically her world. Dysfunctional family, won't go into all the details, but at the age of about 9, she's sexually abused by a family member. She's at a party a little bit later on, and one of these relatives that gave her a couple of little drinks of scotch, and she got really tipsy quite quickly. And they thought it was funny to give her a whole lot more. So this 10-year-old girl gets wasted on whiskey, on spirits. But from Michelle's own words, what happened for her during that was that as a little girl, not understanding her pain, not understanding what's happened to her, as you can imagine, a 9-year-old girl being so violated by a family member, someone who's supposed to love and nurture them. And then she's given a substance. And all she knows is that when I had that, I felt yucky afterwards, but when I had it, I felt okay. I felt good. She had no supports, whatnot. She goes to high school, and of course she's been sexualised in the worst kind of way so young. She hits puberty very early. An older girl in the school picks up with her and notices that she's rebellious and hardcore and gets her in, this girl's 16, 17 and she's 14. But gets her involved in cannabis. And then after a while she says, older girl says to her, this is expensive stuff. I know how to make money. Boys like us, they'll pay for sex. Over the next 5, 6, 7 years, she transitioned into basically full-blown prostitution just to deal with her habit. She'd take heroin during the day to sleep, and she'd take amphetamines at night to function as a prostitute. So you can see the cycle. Now, she wanted to get off this, and she found it was really tough for her, and pharmacotherapy was really helpful for her. She went through naltrexone, which was incredibly useful for her. But the upshot of that is that she's off the drugs. She wants to get pregnant. She just wants to be a mum. That's their big, I want to be a mum. I just long to be a mum. She's had 5 pregnancies. 4 of them failed. They all self-terminated. And she had one little baby. She was so excited, but that baby was so congenitally deformed, so damaged because of her drug use, that after several operations and everything the doctors could do to save it, and her longing for that baby to be saved, it died. She was shattered. And you can imagine where that drove her to. I want to go back to the drugs. I just want to feel okay again. I totally understand the pain that screams out, I just want to feel better. But the majority of young people who take up drugs, that's not their story. The vast majority, that's not their story. Remember, it's peer pressure and curiosity. But the second one is relational poverty. Now, this is really interesting. We are arguably the most connected generation that's ever lived on the planet. But real engagement and authentic non-sexual intimacy is vanishing. We're a sexualized culture and we're online. We hook up. We're more connected than ever, but less connected than ever. One study done in Australia is around 1,000 year 10 students, or 15-year-olds, were surveyed. They were asked what was the most useful thing for them to help them prevent them from getting involved in destructive behaviours, like, drug use, crime, and even promiscuity. 87% of this quite significant sample said the thing that they needed the most to help them not do those things was the involvement of an older, significant other in their world who cared about them. Now, that may not be apparent. It should be apparent, but we know that's not always the case, and that's why we have mentors. So relational poverty is a real driver, and again, that buys into the peer pressure and the curiosity thing. Now, the third thing, which I think is interesting, that we've identified to see are we medicating or are we alleviating, is what we call the residing absurdity. When absurdity is in your world and everything's just absurd and ridiculous and pointless, then you act out. You do whatever you need to do to not feel absurd and ridiculous and pointless. And I think that's one of the biggest drivers for substance use. There's a disconnect from really sustainable meaning in our culture, and particularly for our young people. Anxiety and depression are exponentially growing in that demographic. And of course, they want to seek medication for that, don't they? Recalcitrant hedonism, not going to go into that today, but that's a growing sense of, hey, listen, I'm going to live for myself. I'm just going to party hard, do whatever. Ultimately, there's no meaning, so I just do what I want. I'm going to feel good going out. And that's a growing demographic as well. The first two domains looked at, we need to address. We need to address the cognitive domain. We need to address the affective domain, very, very important. That's a big one. But this last one is really, really interesting. Judicial domain. It's what we call the legislative educator. Judicial education. Demand reduction supporting legislation is the last key piece to facilitating cultural shift. Legal system is not about punitive responses. Punishment, you're a bad person, I'm going to make you pay. That's not what this is about. That doesn't change behaviour. Rather, it's about incentivised facilitation of intentional and accountable change. It's an educative process, not a punitive one. Without this motivation, many drug users remain careless about their impact on themselves and those around them. Educate and legislate. Education and legislation together do far more at reducing demand than education alone. And those out there who say, oh, you don't need legislation, you just need education, are selling you something. You need both. Civil societies are about helping us all function well together, not just trying to stand up for every single individual right that might exist because someone's felt need demands it. We need to be looking out for what is best practice for all. Health, productivity, family, community. These are things we need to look at. Using the law smart is a really key issue here. That's why legislative or judicial domain education is very powerful. Now, for example, a practical way this has been done globally and working remarkably well is drug treatment courts. So these are a key to change and really doing great work in helping drug use offenders actually not just stay out of jail, but more importantly, transition out of drug use. Sure, not 100% success rate, but making some great steps forward. But I've also spent time with one of the architects of drug courts in the US, and this is some of the data that's coming out of there, which is quite fascinating. Drug court clients remain in treatment twice as long as non-drug court clients, double the chance of completing treatment, do less crime, arrested less, and reduce drug use, reduce victimisation, and that's really key, not just to themselves, but their family and their communities. 5, save families. Children are up to 40% more likely to be reunified with families and spend significantly less time in foster care when their parents go through drug courts. Incarceration costs in the US are around 18 grand a year. It's about a year or so old, this stat, but around 18 grand a year. Drug treatment court costs per annum for the same offender, 4 grand a year. Every dollar invested in judicial domain education through drug courts saves $27 in socioeconomic benefits. It's remarkable. I noticed recent in the news here, Andrew Chan, who's a convicted drug smuggler of heroin, famously known as the Bali Nine, and Andrew had been involved in drugs for a long time before he got caught smuggling into Bali. In fact, he got done for drug possession, drug sales. He started in high school. Nothing slowed him down. Nothing changed him. You know, he was going to keep using and dealing drugs because it was a bit of a joke until he lands in Bali. The laws are quite clear. If you smuggle drugs into a lot of these Southeast Asian countries, you will go to jail for a long time or die. That's the law. I mean, and everybody knows this. So you do this at your own risk. It's amazing what that whole reward risk thing, the coding does. There's not much risk. What's going to happen? I get caught? Yeah, the Australian embassy will let me out, or, you know, I'll get let off, or, you know, because that's what's happened in my own country. But in Bali, that's not what happened. Now, as a result, Andrew is not only incarcerated, he is sentenced to death. Now, we've co-produced a film about his life we recently released called Dear Me. But in that, he talks about what happened to him as a result of that. This incarceration, no turning back, no second chance, changed him. Access to drugs was gone, so he couldn't have a quick fix for the vicissitudes that he's now experiencing. He had to deal with his reality. He was going to be held accountable in the most horrendous way. He's going to lose his life. He says, my life is a disaster. The accountability process stopped him and he recalibrated. As a result, he made some remarkable changes, which you can find out for yourself and what he's done. He is now not only a model prisoner, but he's helping others get off drugs, stay off drugs, reinvent themselves in life, give them meaning, purpose, direction, support, mentorship, all the things that he needed and all the things he should have had. He's now dealing out and doling out to others and making a remarkable difference. And he's not doing that to be exonerated from his crimes. He says, I'm going to die. They could take me at any time of the night and they can shoot me. I'm not looking forward to that, but that's my reality. And it's amazing, as severe and austere as it is, that accountability was a key element to change for him. And I think judicial domain education, affective domain education, and cognitive domain education working together can help us shift the culture away from this permissiveness, its inevitability of drug use culture, and which the pro-drug lobby wants you to think so they can sell and promote their products. We can move it away from that to a prevention model that sees less and less and less young people take up substances and more people recover from them. It is simple. It's just not easy. But like Lou Gehrig's disease, we want to have a community free from drug use. And we can do that if we work together. Government, community, family, education, media. We work together, we can make a difference. And I want to say thank you very much for your time.